So picture the year 911.
Oh man, such a wild year.
Right, it really is. So the heir to Charlemagne's, massive world-shaping empire is completely cornered by a giant Viking pirate.
Quite literally cornered.
Yeah. And the Viking had, for all intents and purposes, he'd won. He and his fleets had just been absolutely terrorizing the Seine Valley, laying siege to Paris, bleeding the royal treasury totally dry.
Just relentless raiding.
Exactly. So you would assume, right, that this is the moment the king loses his head. Or, at the very least, loses his throne.
Right. That would be the standard medieval playbook.
Yeah. But instead of slaughtering the king, they make this bizarre, seemingly desperate real estate deal right on the muddy banks of a river in northern France.
A deal that changes everything.
And here is the truly mind-bending part for you listening today. That specific, desperate bargain is the exact reason you and I are speaking English the way we are speaking it right now.
It's arguably one of the most consequential compromises ever struck in European history. I mean, it completely rewired the geopolitical map of the Middle Ages.
And that is our mission for this deep dive. I'm your host, by the way.
And I'm here to bring the historical context.
Yes, you are. So we are taking our sources today, and we're unpacking how this single pragmatic deal transformed a Viking raider into a state builder, created the, terrifyingly effective culture of the Normans, and set off a chain reaction that culminated in the year 1066.
The famous 1066.
The big one. So the Viking's name was Rollo. He stopped raiding, and he started a dynasty.
Which really forces us to completely reevaluate the Viking Age as a whole. We tend to view that era as just this prolonged period of apocalyptic destruction.
Just fire and axes.
Exactly. But Rollo's story demonstrates that it was equally an era of profound transformation, assimilation, and state building.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because before we can even begin to understand the geopolitics of this empire-altering deal, I need to understand this pirate.
He's a fascinating figure.
He really is. Because our sources mention his name was Rollo, but if he's this massive Scandinavian warlord, Rollo sounds, I don't know, strangely Italian, or maybe Latin.
It does.
It just doesn't sound very Viking.
Well, that is a very astute observation, because Rollo is not the name his mother gave him.
Oh, really?
No, it's a Latinized version of his name. You have to remember who was actually writing the history books in the 10th century.
Right. It wasn't the Vikings writing things down.
Exactly. It was Frankish monks, church clerks, and they wrote exclusively in Latin. So they had this habit of taking foreign, guttural Germanic or Norse names and just softening them to fit Latin grammatical structures.
So it's basically just an administrative translation.
Pretty much.
What was his actual name then?
His actual Old Norse name was almost certainly Hrolfr, which translates into modern times as Rolf.
Rolf. Okay.
Yeah. So when a Frankish clerk tried to write down Hrolf in a legal document or like a church annal, they smoothed it out into Rollo so they could easily apply Latin case endings to it.
Rolfer. Okay, well, that definitely sounds much more intimidating than Rollo.
It has a bit more of a growl to it.
It does. But I am even more fascinated by his nickname in the sagas, Gungu Rolfer, which translates to Rollo the Walker.
Yes, the Walker.
Now, if I am a terrifying Viking warlord commanding a massive fleet, the Walker feels like a terrible nickname. It sounds like, a zombie from a TV show, not a conqueror. Why wasn't he riding a massive warhorse like everyone else?
Well, the legend behind that nickname is actually a testament to his physical size. According to the Scandinavian sagas, he was simply too massive, too tall, and too heavy for any horse to carry him.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the sagas claim that horses would literally buckle under his weight. So this giant warlord was forced to just walk into battle on foot.
Was he actually an 8-foot-tall giant, or is that just like the medieval version of a tall tale?
Right, we have to navigate carefully here between saga legend and historical reality. Was he a literal mythological giant? Probably not.
Right.
It's a really common trope in medieval literature to exaggerate the physical stature of dynasty founders, to emphasize their larger-than-life legacy.
Sure, make the founder look tough.
Exactly. However, there is a very grounded biological reality to consider regarding the horses of the 9th and 10th centuries.
What do you mean? Were the horses just smaller back then?
In Scandinavia, absolutely. The native Scandinavian horse breeds of that era, which are similar to the modern Norwegian fjord horse or the Icelandic horse, they were relatively small, stocky animals.
Like ponies?
We might look at them today and call them ponies, yeah. They were incredibly hardy, built to survive brutal winters and navigate rocky, mountainous terrain, but they were definitely not bred for carrying massive weight.
Oh, wow. So if you have a Viking warrior who is, say, 6'4", incredibly muscular,
Right.
and then you add 30 or 40 pounds of chainmail armor, a heavy wooden shield, a sword, an axe.
That poor Scandinavian pony is not going anywhere.
Exactly. The physics simply don't work.
They don't. A heavily muscled, armored warrior could easily exceed the weight capacity of those specific regional breeds. So while the giant aspect might be colorful myth-making, the idea that a particularly large Norseman was too heavy for his local mount is entirely plausible.
That's amazing.
It suggests a man of immense physical presence, sheer intimidating power.
Which you would absolutely need, right, if you are trying to keep thousands of bloodthirsty pirates in
Yeah.
line. You lead by being the scariest guy in the room.
Precisely.
But where did this guy actually come from? Because our sources mention that his origin story is basically a historical custody battle.
Oh, it has been a matter of intense national pride and fierce academic debate for centuries. The dispute primarily lies between the Norwegian saga tradition and the Danish historical tradition.
Okay, so who claims him first?
Well, on one side, you have the Norwegians, who firmly identify Gungulf Rolfr as one of their own. In the Norwegian telling, specifically in the writings of Snorri Sturluson, he was the son of a powerful Norwegian jarl, or nobleman, named Ragnvald Eysteinsen.
So he was basically medieval royalty who went rogue.
According to that specific tradition, yes. The story goes that Rollo committed an act of plunder within Norwegian territory, which deeply angered the King of Norway, Harald Fairhair.
Big mistake.
Huge mistake. King Harald outlawed him, and Rollo was forced into exile. So he took to the sea to seek his fortune as a raider in Scotland, Ireland, and eventually France.
That makes for a great origin story, honestly. The exiled prince turning to a life of crime.
Oh.
But you mentioned a custody battle. Who else is claiming him?
The Danes claim him just as fiercely. The Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, writing in the late 12th century, he insists that Rollo was a Danish nobleman.
Oh, interesting.
And other early Norman historians, like Dudo of St. Quentin, also point toward Denmark. Now, Dudo wrote the first formal history of the Normans, and he claims Rollo was forced out of Denmark due to a conflict with the Danish king.
Wait, if the guy who literally wrote the first official history of the Normans says he was Danish, shouldn't that settle it? Why are we even debating the Norwegian side?
Because Dudo of St. Quentin is a highly problematic source.
Ah, okay. How so?
Well, he was writing almost a century after Rollo's death, and he was heavily commissioned by Rollo's grandson to write what was essentially a flattering propaganda piece.
A PR campaign for the dynasty.
Exactly. Dudo's job was to legitimize the Norman dynasty, so he often blended myths, he conflated different Viking leaders, and sometimes just invented things wholesale to make his patrons look good.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, the term Danes was often used by the Franks as a generic catch-all term for any Scandinavian raider, regardless of whether they were actually from Denmark, Norway, or Sweden.
So Dane was basically just medieval slang for Viking.
In many Frankish texts, yes. So modern scholars still meticulously weigh the saga evidence against archaeological clues and linguistic traces, but there is no unassailable answer.
So we just don't know for sure.
The most honest historical position we can take is that Rollo was a powerful Scandinavian warlord, most likely of Norwegian descent, but heavily involved with Danish fleets whose exact beginnings are obscured by time and competing national myths.
You know, that kind of reminds me of Ragnar Lothbrok. We've talked about him before, and it was the same deal. This swirling blend of myth, legend, and maybe a few different guys mashed into one character.
I am so glad you brought up Ragnar because it provides a crucial contrast here. Figures like Ragnar Lothbrok are deeply shrouded in myth to the point where many historians debate if a single Ragnar ever really existed, or if his legend is a composite of several different 9th century raiders.
Right.
Rollo is entirely different. Rollo is solidly, undeniably historical.
So we aren't guessing if he actually existed.
Not at all. We have the Frankish royal charters, we have the specific treaties he signed,
Paper trail.
a massive paper trail. We have the records of his land grants, the church annals documenting his baptism, and the unbroken dynasty of dukes he founded. The only fog surrounding Rollo is his childhood. By the time we reach the early 900s, that fog clears completely and he emerges on the historical stage as a dominant, terrifyingly real Viking leader operating in northern France with a massive force of Norsemen.
Okay, so let's set the stage in France. Because if I am the king of France, or the Frankish kingdom as it was called, I am not just handing over a massive province to a pirate unless my back is completely against the wall.
Right.
If Rollo was just one Viking with a fleet, why didn't the king just send the royal army to crush him? Was the French military really that weak?
Well, the problem wasn't necessarily that the Frankish military was weak in terms of fighting capability. The problem was that the entire political structure of the empire was crumbling.
Oh, I see.
King Charles the Simple's back was very much against the wall because the central authority of his government had practically evaporated. To understand this, we really have to look back a century to his ancestor, Charlemagne.
Right. Charlemagne is the famous one. He built this massive empire.
He built a vast, terrifyingly powerful, and highly centralized empire. It was the closest thing to a revived Roman Empire the West had seen. Charlemagne could raise massive armies, dictate laws from the center, secure his borders.
So what went wrong?
After he died, his descendants adhered to the Frankish custom of dividing their inheritance.
Oh, no. So instead of the oldest son getting the empire, they chop it up into pieces.
They chopped it up into pieces, gave a piece to each son, and those sons immediately went to war with each other over the borders.
Of course they did.
Then those sons died, and the pieces were chopped up again. This triggered decades of brutal civil wars. And while the royals were busy fighting each other, they completely neglected the defense of the coastlines.
And the Vikings were watching.
They were actively exploiting it. For decades, Viking fleets had realized that the great rivers of France, especially the Seine and the Loire, they weren't just rivers. To a fleet of shallow draft Viking longships, those rivers were undefended superhighways leading straight into the wealthy, soft underbelly of the kingdom.
You mentioned shallow draft ships. Explain why that matters for a river. Because I assume most ocean-going ships couldn't just sail up to Paris.
That is the technological genius of the Viking longship. Most European ships of the era had deep keels. They needed deep water to sail, which meant they were largely confined to the sea or very large estuaries.
Makes sense.
But the Viking longship had an incredibly shallow draft, meaning it could float in water just 3 or 4 feet deep.
Wow, that's nothing.
They could cross the brutal, stormy, open ocean and then seamlessly transition into a shallow inland river without having to switch boats. They could row right past the coastal defenses and strike dozens, even hundreds of miles inland where the Franks kept their wealthiest, undefended monasteries and market towns.
So they were basically bypassing the medieval equivalent of border security.
Entirely. And because the central government was paralyzed by civil war, the local populations were left to fend for themselves. Power began draining away from the king and pooling in the hands of local strongmen. Counts and dukes who could actually provide immediate protection started building private castles and raising their own private armies.
Okay, so if I'm a peasant living along the Seine, I stop paying attention to the king in Paris, and I start listening to the local duke who have a castle down the road, because he's the one who can actually stop a Viking axe from hitting me.
That is the exact mechanism of early feudalism. The king is still sitting on a throne, wearing a crown, but his actual practical power barely reaches past his own royal estates.
He's just a figurehead, basically.
He has to constantly negotiate with his own nobles just to get them to show up for a war. And this geopolitical chaos culminated in a truly devastating event, which was the Great Siege of Paris from 885 to 886.
Let's break down the mechanics of that siege. Because how does a fleet of boats lay siege to a landlocked city? I always picture sieges involving massive catapults and armies surrounding a stone castle in a field.
Well, in the 9th century, the core of Paris was located on an island in the middle of the Seine River, the Ile de la Cité. It was heavily fortified with walls, and the Franks had built 2 massive fortified bridges connecting the island to the north and south banks of the river. These bridges were specifically designed to physically block Viking ships from sailing further upstream into the heart of Burgundy.
So it's a toll booth that you cannot get past.
A heavily armed toll booth. In 885, an absolutely massive Viking fleet, some chronicles claim it was 700 ships and nearly 40,000 men.
Whoa.
Though modern historians suspect those numbers are exaggerated, but still, a massive fleet sailed up the Seine and demanded passage. They didn't even want to sack Paris initially, they just wanted to go further upriver to loot the interior.
But the Franks said no.
The local Frankish leader, Odo, Count of Paris, refused to let them pass.
So the Vikings have to take the bridges.
And they spent nearly a year trying. They used battering rams, they built siege towers on the decks of their ships, they tried to burn the bridge down by sending fire ships down the current.
That sounds terrifying.
The local Parisians fought back fiercely, pouring boiling oil, dropping massive stones. firing thousands of arrows. The siege was a nightmare of attrition, disease, and starvation for both sides.
But Paris held out. Right. I thought Paris survived.
Paris held out heroically for months. But the response from the central monarchy was a humiliating disaster. The emperor at the time, Charles the Fat, finally arrived with a massive relief army.
Oh, good. The cavalry arrives.
The Parisians thought they were saved. They thought the emperor was going to crush the Viking army against the walls of the city.
But he didn't.
He didn't even fight them.
Wait, what?
Charles the Fat looked at the massive Viking host, calculated the risks, and decided to pay them off. He paid them a massive ransom in silver, known as the Danegeld, and to add insult to injury, he gave them permission to sail past Paris and spend the winter ravaging the region of Burgundy.
You are kidding me.
Which was conveniently in rebellion against him at the time.
Oh, wow. So the emperor essentially used the Vikings as a mercenary hit squad against his own rebellious subjects while abandoning the very people who had just spent a year defending his capital.
It was a catastrophic failure of central leadership. It proved to everyone, the Vikings and the Frankish nobles, that the monarchy was weak, cowardly, and untrustworthy. It also proved to the Vikings that the Danegeld was a highly lucrative business model.
Let's talk about the Danegeld, actually, because we hear that term a lot. How does that extortion mechanically work? If you are a king and you promise a Viking warlord thousands of pounds of silver, where does that actually come from? The king doesn't just have a giant vault of coins sitting around.
No, to understand the Danegeld, you really have to look at the medieval economy. Wealth was primarily tied to agricultural production. When the king agreed to pay a Danegeld, he essentially had to levy a massive emergency tax across his entire kingdom.
Okay.
He would send out his royal agents to every local lord, every monastery, and every bishop, demanding a specific quota of silver.
And I'm guessing the lords and bishops didn't pay it out of their own pockets. They squeezed the peasants.
Relentlessly. They would force the peasantry to sell their grain, their livestock, or their tools to raise the coinage.
That's brutal.
Monasteries would be forced to melt down their sacred golden chalices, their silver crucifixes, and the jeweled covers of their Bibles. It was a massive, traumatic extraction of wealth from the bottom of society straight up to the top and then out into the hands of the invaders.
Yeah.
And the worst part is, paying extortion money only proves to the extortionist that your business is highly profitable.
Right. If you pay the bully for lunch money on Monday, he's going to be back on Tuesday. You haven't bought peace. You've just subsidized his next attack.
Which brings us back to Rollo and King Charles the Simple in the early 900s. By this point, Rollo isn't just hitting and running anymore. He is staying.
He's moving in.
He has taken control of the Lower Seine Valley, the area around the city of Rouen. He is extracting tribute locally, bypassing the king entirely, and he's rooting his people into the soil.
He's making himself a permanent problem. And the Franks tried to fight him, right? Our sources mention a battle at Chartres.
Yes, the Franks did manage to muster an army, and they successfully defeated Rollo's forces at the Battle of Chartres in 911. But here is the crucial political reality. They defeated him in a field battle, but they lacked the logistical capability to uproot his settlements around Rouen.
Oh, I see.
They couldn't push him back into the sea. He was too entrenched.
So it's a stalemate. The Vikings can't conquer the whole kingdom, but the Franks can't evict the Vikings.
A bloody, exhausting stalemate. And this is where King Charles the Simple makes what I consider to be a brilliantly pragmatic, if desperate, calculation. It results in the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in the autumn of 911.
Let's look at the mechanics of this deal, because it seems completely counterintuitive to me. Charles offers Rollo a massive swath of territory, the land around Rouen, which eventually expands into the province of Normandy.
Right.
Rollo gets to settle there, rule it, and legally keep it. Why would a king give away his own country to the guy who's been burning it down?
Because Charles the Simple realized a hard geopolitical truth. He was giving away land that he didn't actually control anyway. Rollo already occupied Rouen. The king was essentially putting a legal stamp of approval on a military reality. But the conditions Charles attached to the land grant are what make it a masterstroke of medieval statecraft.
What were the conditions?
First, Rollo had to become the king's vassal. He had to formally submit to Charles's authority.
Okay.
Second, he had to accept Christian baptism and encourage his followers to convert. And third, the absolute kicker, Rollo had to pledge to defend the mouth of the Seine River from all other Viking fleets.
Okay, wait. So This is essentially a protection racket that the government decided to legalize. If you can't beat the mob, you make the mob boss the chief of police.
That is a remarkably accurate analogy. Charles was hiring the wolf to guard the flock. He knew he couldn't stop the incoming Viking fleets with his own fractured feudal military. So he took his deadliest enemy and turned him into a human shield. By placing Rollo at the mouth of the river, Charles turned a gaping wound in his kingdom into a fortified, heavily armed wall.
It's genius. And for Rollo, it makes sense too, right?
Yeah.
Being a pirate sounds fun in your 20s, but it is a perilous, exhausting life. You are constantly at the mercy of storms, starvation, battle wounds.
It's a young man's game.
Exactly. With this deal, Rollo trades the unstable life of a sea raider for permanent, legitimate dynastic power. He becomes a recognized lord of Europe.
It was a deal that bought everyone exactly what they needed. Charles got security for Paris, and Rollo got an undeniable stake in the wealth of France. However, executing this deal required navigating an incredibly tense cultural minefield.
Because the Vikings were notoriously proud, and they didn't just quietly put on suits and become bureaucrats. The sources have this incredible story about the actual treaty ceremony and the legendary foot-kissing incident.
Oh, this is one of those dramatic beats in history that perfectly illustrates the psychological friction of this treaty. In order to finalize the deal, Rollo had to become a vassal.
Right.
I should explain what vassalage actually meant in the 10th century, because it wasn't just signing a piece of paper. It was a deeply personal, physical, and spiritual contract.
Right. Explain this to me like I'm completely new to medieval politics. What happens in an oath ceremony?
The ceremony of homage was highly ritualized. The prospective vassal would kneel before the Lord, place his hands between the Lord's hands, and swear a holy oath on religious relics to be faithful, to provide military service, and to never harm the Lord.
Okay.
In return, the Lord promised to protect the vassal and grant him a fief, which in this case was the land of Normandy.
Okay, that sounds fairly standard. Hand-holding and promising to be good.
But the Frankish custom of the time also included a final act of ultimate submission. The vassal was required to bow down and kiss the king's foot.
Oh, man. A gesture of total humiliating submission, which, if you are a giant Viking warlord who literally just fought the king to a standstill and forced him to hand over a province, you're absolutely not going to do.
Rollo flatly refused. He stated through interpreters that he would never bow his knees to anyone, nor would he kiss any man's foot.
I don't blame him.
You have to understand the Norse cultural mindset. Their society was highly honor-based. A man's worth was entirely tied to his personal reputation, his strength, and his refusal to be dominated. To kneel and kiss a man's foot was practically an admission of enslavement. It would have destroyed his credibility with his own warriors.
So you have a Mexican standoff on the riverbank. The Frankish king is demanding this ritual to save face in front of his nobles, and the Viking warlord is refusing it to save face in front of his pirates. How do they resolve it?
A compromise is reached. Rollo agrees that the act should be performed, but he will not do it personally. He commands one of his warriors to step forward and perform the foot kissing on his behalf.
I can just picture this scene. The tension must have been suffocating. The Frankish nobles are all standing there in their fine silks and ermine fur, holding their breath. The king extends his foot, and this battle-hardened, scarred Viking steps forward. But he doesn't kneel.
No. According to the chronicles, the Viking warrior steps up to the king, reaches down, grabs the king's foot, and forcefully lifts it straight up in the air to his own mouth to kiss it.
Toppling King Charles the Simple right over backward onto the muddy ground in front of the entire royal assembly.
Yes, sending the monarch sprawling on his back, much to the loud amusement of the assembled Norsemen.
It is brilliant. It's physical comedy, but it is also this massive, aggressive power move. The Franks must have been absolutely scandalized, and the Vikings were basically asserting, we are taking your land, but we are not your servants.
Exactly. Whether the story is perfectly accurate in every mechanical detail, or whether it was slightly embellished by later Norman chroniclers who wanted to highlight their ancestors' independence, it captures a deep historical truth.
It really does.
It perfectly illustrates the prickly, unbending pride of the Norsemen. Even in the moment of formal submission, they refused to be truly humbled. They would take the land, they would swear the oaths, but they would do it standing upright on their own terms.
On the screen, the pop culture representation of this is really interesting. If you've ever seen the TV show Vikings, they handle Rollo's storyline in a fascinating way. Now, full disclosure, the show makes Rollo the literal brother of Ragnar Lothbrok.
Which is chronologically and historically impossible. The events surrounding the historical Ragnar occurred decades before Rollo rose to power. There's absolutely no evidence connecting Rollo to Ragnar's family.
Just TV magic.
It is a pure dramatic invention by the showrunners to tie the early raiding era and the later settlement era together through one family dynamic.
But even though the family tree is totally fake, the show actually brilliantly captures his genuine historical arc. You watch this agonizing identity crisis play out over multiple seasons. You see a brutal Norse raider transforming into a polished Frankish lord.
It's a great character arc.
You see him cut his hair, put on the fine clothes, navigate the treacherous court politics, and eventually the ultimate test comes. He has to stand on a riverbank, command Frankish troops, and violently fight off his own Viking people to defend his new French home. It really zeroes in on the psychological weight of what it actually meant to assimilate. You can't just flip a switch and become French.
And yet, that assimilation is perhaps the most astonishing, rapid cultural mutation in European history. They signed the treaty, but what happens when several thousand pagan sea raiders suddenly have to govern a complex agrarian French province? They don't just settle down and build longhouses. As the sources indicate, they rapidly and almost completely metamorphose into something entirely new.
This is the part that blows my mind. We are talking about Vikings who gave up their language, their religion, their entire traditional way of doing things at an unprecedented speed. How fast did this happen?
Within 2 to 3 generations, the transformation was nearly absolute.
Wow, that fast.
You have to look at the demographics of the settlement. Rollo's army wasn't a mass migration of entire Norse families. It was primarily an army of young, aggressive men. When they settled in Normandy, they didn't bring tens of thousands of Scandinavian women with them. They intermarried with the local Frankish population.
Okay, so a Viking warrior takes a French wife.
Yes. And who raises the children? The mothers. The children of these Norse warriors grew up listening to their mothers speak early French. They grew up integrated into the local agrarian economy. So within a few decades, the descendants of Rollo's Vikings were no longer speaking Old Norse. They were speaking a regional dialect of French.
And religion. Did they actually give up Odin and Thor, or were they just crossing their figures behind their backs when they got baptized?
Initially, there was likely a lot of syncretism, blending the old gods with the new. But very quickly, they adopted Christianity, and they didn't do it by half measures.
They went all in.
They did. The Normans, which is the term that evolved from Northmania, the land of the Northmen, became famously devout. They embraced the militant, highly organized structure of the Catholic Church. They became great builders of massive stone abbeys and towering cathedrals. They became fierce, uncompromising champions of the Pope.
So they basically looked at the Frankish feudal system and the church and said, we can do this better than you.
That is exactly the dynamic. They also completely overhauled their military tactics, and this is perhaps the most dramatic shift.
Right, because Vikings are famous for two things in battle.
Yeah.
The longship and the shield wall. Infantry fighting on foot with axes and spears. But the Normans don't fight like that. How do you go from a boat to a horse?
It requires a massive societal restructuring. The Normans traded their longships for war horses, and they evolved into armored knights. To do this, you can't just capture a horse and jump on its back. The heavy cavalry of the 11th century relied on highly specialized breeding programs to produce the destrier, the medieval war horse. These horses had to be large enough to carry a man in full chainmail armor and aggressive enough to charge into a wall of spears.
Breeding horses takes decades. It takes massive amounts of pasture land, stables, grain to feed them. You are transforming your entire economy to support this new weapon.
Furthermore, you have to master the technology of the couched lance. By the 11th century, the adoption of the stirrup and the high-backed saddle allowed a rider to tuck a heavy wooden lance tightly under his arm.
Oh, like a joust.
Exactly. Instead of just thrusting with the strength of his shoulder, the knight could channel the entire momentum of a galloping 1,200-pound horse into the tip of the lance. It was a devastating, armor-piercing shock tactic. But learning to ride like that in tight formation requires years of dedicated, full-time training.
Which means you can't just be a farmer who picks up an axe when the king calls. You have to be a professional warrior.
Precisely why they embraced the feudal system so deeply. The feudal system provided the economic foundation, peasant labor, generating agricultural surplus to support a class of professional, highly trained mounted knights.
Wait, if they assimilated so completely speaking French, riding horses, building cathedrals, did they completely wipe away their Viking past? Is there any proof that the Vikings were actually there, besides a few lines in a history book?
It is a critical question. The answer is that while they completely adopted the external cultural markers of the Franks, the language, the religion, the military tech, they retained their Norse psychological DNA.
Explain what you mean by psychological DNA.
I mean, the relentless ambition, the restless aggression, the absolute drive for adventure, expansion, and conquest. The Normans were not content to just sit in their castles and collect taxes.
They wanted more.
They were essentially Vikings upgraded with medieval Frankish technology and fueled by a militant brand of Christianity. They took the Viking spirit of expedition and channeled it through highly organized feudal forms.
That sounds dangerous.
It was. This fusion created a cultural war machine that would soon explode out of Normandy, not just to England, but to conquer southern Italy, seize Sicily from the Byzantine and Islamic empires, and lead the First Crusade to Jerusalem.
They were the shock troops of the Middle Ages.
Hmm.
But did they leave physical traces in Normandy? Like literal fingerprints on the landscape?
Oh, absolutely. The proof is hidden in plain sight on the modern map of France. If you look at the names of towns and villages across the Normandy region today, you will find the ghosts of the Vikings embedded deeply in the soil. There are distinct clusters of place names that use Old Norse suffixes.
Give me an example. What am I looking for on a map?
You will see dozens of towns ending in the suffix tot, like Ipto or Kubelsusen. Tot comes from the Old Norse word toft, meaning a homestead or a clearing. You will see names ending in beck, derived from the Norse word bekker, meaning a stream or brook. You have names ending in fleur, like enfleur, coming from the Norse fløy, meaning a gulf or a bay.
So every time a French person drives through a town ending in tot, they are literally speaking fossilized Old Norse, even if they don't realize it.
Yes, and the linguistic footprint doesn't stop at geography. The local French dialect in Normandy, and eventually Standard French itself, absorbed a significant amount of Norse vocabulary, specifically related to the sea.
Makes sense.
Words for parts of ships, navigation, seafaring. For instance, the French word for a ship's crew, équipage, has roots in Norse. The French word for a wave, vague, comes from Old Norse.
That makes perfect sense. They adopted the French language for talking about farming and land law, but they kept their own Norse words for the sea because they were the supreme sailors of their age. The Franks didn't have the vocabulary for advanced sailing, so the Vikings kept their own.
It is a perfect linguistic division of labor. Furthermore, modern science has provided another undeniable layer of proof. Genetic researchers have conducted studies looking for Scandinavian ancestry in the modern population of Normandy today.
Wait, can they actually find Viking DNA in a French farmer 1,000 years later?
They can. While the Norse settlers integrated heavily and quickly with the much larger local Frankish population, there is a real regionally concentrated Norse genetic contribution.
That is so cool.
And fascinatingly, that DNA signature is strongest right in the specific coastal areas like the Cotentin Peninsula, where those Tot and Beck place names are the most densely clustered. So the modern genetics, the linguistics, and the 10th century historical records all perfectly corroborate each other.
It's incredible. They became French, but the Viking is still there.
Yeah.
Literally in their blood and in the dirt under their feet. But let's look at how Rollo himself actually managed this transition. Because it is one thing to be handed a province on a piece of parchment. It is an entirely different challenge to actually govern it and build an economy. How does a pirate run a state?
By all accounts, Rollo proved to be an exceptionally effective, albeit ruthless, administrator. He didn't just treat Normandy as a massive, secure base camp for launching more raids. He genuinely set about consolidating order.
Where did he start?
The first thing he did was distribute the land among his chief Norse warriors.
So he takes his ship captains and turns them into counts and barons.
Exactly. He turned his mobile ship-based warband into a rooted landed nobility. This fundamentally changed their economic incentives. When you are a raider on a boat, your wealth comes from stealing what other people have grown.
Right.
But when you are given an estate, your wealth depends on the peasants on your land successfully growing crops year after year. Suddenly, Rollo's warriors had a vested interest in protecting the land, maintaining the peace, and ensuring the harvest weren't burned down.
You can't plunder your own farm.
You cannot. And to protect this new agrarian economy, Rollo instituted incredibly strict laws regarding theft and property. There is a very famous legend recorded in our sources about just how safe Normandy became under his rule.
Oh, the gold bracelet story. I love this one. The legend says his justice was so harsh and his law enforcement so absolute that a man could hang a solid gold bracelet on the branch of a tree in an open field and leave it there for a year, and no one would dare steal it out of sheer terror of Rollo's punishment.
Now, we should view that specific story with a degree of skepticism.
Oh, sure.
It is a very common literary trope in medieval history to praise a strong ruler by claiming you could leave gold on the road or a virgin could walk unmolested from one end of the kingdom to the other.
It's propaganda to show he was a law and order candidate.
It is. But the fact that this specific trope was attached to Rollo highlights a profound historical irony.
He is the ultimate poacher turned gamekeeper.
He truly is. The man who had spent the first half of his life breaking every law, ignoring every border, and violently plundering the wealth of others became, within his own domain, a ferocious, uncompromising protector of private property.
That's amazing.
He maintained his side of the bargain with the French king, successfully defending the Seine River from other Viking incursions, but he was simultaneously building Normandy into a powerful, increasingly autonomous, self-sufficient state. He laid the institutional and legal foundations that allowed his duchy to not only survive his death around the year 930, but to grow steadily stronger with each passing generation.
Speaking of his death, didn't he have a bit of a crisis of faith at the very end?
There are persistent rumors and accounts that as Rollo lay on his deathbed, slipping in and out of consciousness, his newly adopted Christianity began to fracture.
Wow.
The stories claim that he authorized massive donations of gold to the Christian churches to secure his soul, but at the exact same time, he ordered the ritual sacrifice of hundreds of prisoners to appease the old pagan gods of his youth.
Just in case. Play both sides, hedge your bets, and see who opens the gates of the afterlife for you. It shows that underneath the baptism and the French titles, the Old Norse worldview was still deeply ingrained in him. But we really need to get to the massive historical payoff of Rollo's rule, the ultimate climax of his bloodline, because you can trace a direct, unbroken line from that muddy riverbank in 9/11 straight to the year 1066.
This is where the story shifts from regional European politics to world-altering global history. The year 1066, as most people know, marks the Norman conquest of England. William the Conqueror crosses the English Channel with a massive invasion fleet, defeats the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson at the brutal Battle of Hastings, and violently seizes the English throne.
And William the Conqueror is Rollo's direct descendant.
He is. William is Rollo's great-great-great-grandson in the direct male line. William held the exact same title, Duke of Normandy, that Rollo had established a century and a half earlier.
So if you step back and look at the whole geopolitical board, the conquest of England wasn't just done by the French, which is how it's often casually taught. It was done by the descendants of Vikings.
Yes.
There was Norsemen who had settled in France, swapped their longships for heavy cavalry, learned to speak French, adopted the Pope's religion, and then turned around, built a new fleet, and conquered an island across the sea.
It is a stunning historical trajectory. And if we connect this to the broader context of English history, the irony of 1066 deepens even further. Because the England that William invaded had already been heavily shaped, settled, and repeatedly conquered by other Vikings over the previous 2 centuries.
Right, the Danelaw. Half of England had been ruled by Danes. Even the previous English kings, like Kenneth the Great, were literally Scandinavian royalty.
Exactly. The Anglo-Saxon military culture of England was deeply intertwined with Norse tactics. King Harold's elite troops at Hastings, the Housecarls, fought on foot with massive two-handed Danish battle axes, utilizing the traditional Viking shield wall.
Right.
So at the Battle of Hastings, you effectively have the descendants of Norsemen, draped in French chainmail and riding heavy war horses, violently conquering an island that was already heavily populated by the descendants of other Norsemen fighting in the old Viking style.
It is literally Vikings fighting Vikings, just separated by a few generations of different cultural adaptations. It is the grand, bloody finale of the entire Viking age.
It truly is. The Norman conquest integrated England into the continental political sphere, severed its primary ties with Scandinavia, and radically reshaped its institutions. And none of that happens if Rollo doesn't accept the land from Charles the Simple.
And for you listening, this isn't just dry historical trivia. This specific chain of events impacts you every single day of your life. Because of Rollo's deal, and because his descendant William conquered England, the English language was permanently, violently flooded with French vocabulary.
The linguistic impact of 1066 cannot be overstated. For centuries after the conquest, the ruling class of England, the kings, the nobles, the judges, the bishops, they spoke Norman French, while the common people spoke Old English. Over time, those 2 languages crashed into each other and merged into Middle English.
So every time you speak English today, you are tasting the ripples of that riverbank deal in 9/11. The core simple words of our language are usually Germanic Anglo-Saxon. Words like house, friend, water, cow, pig. But the elevated vocabulary, the words of power, administration, and law, were all brought over by Rollo's descendants.
Words like justice, army, castle.
Royal, beef, pork, court, government. They're all French imports. We literally speak a hybrid language because a giant Viking couldn't fit on a horse.
The linguistic, architectural, and political connections forged by the Normans bound England to continental Europe in a way that changed the entire trajectory of the Western world. The British Empire, the founding of America, the global spread of the English language. The seed of all of that was planted in the soil of Normandy by a pirate looking for a retirement plan.
Going back to the TV show Vikings for a second. On the screen, when you watch Rollo accept that Frankish title, put on the heavy velvet robes, and look out over his new lands, you aren't just watching a character's storyline wrap up. If you know the history, you realize you were literally watching the fuse being lit for the Battle of Hastings. It's wild to think about the butterfly effect of that one moment of compromise.
It really is. To synthesize the core theme we've explored today, history often portrays the Viking Age purely as an era of trauma, of tearing down the established medieval world, looting monasteries, burning libraries, but Rollo's narrative proves it was equally about building it. The Viking Age is beautifully, perfectly bookended.
How so?
Well, it opens in the year 793 with the shock and absolute violence of pagan raiders attacking the undefended monastery at Lindisfarne. A sudden, terrifying destruction from the sea.
Yeah.
And the era closes in 1066 with the highly organized descendants of those Vikings fighting as devout Christian knights under a papal banner, conquering a centralized kingdom in order to rule it and tax it. Rollo is the hinge of history between those 2 points. He is the man who taught the Vikings how to evolve from raiders extracting wealth into rulers generating it.
He showed them how to evolve. And I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on today. We spend so much time in history, and honestly in our modern media, obsessing over conquerors who wipe out their enemies. We glorify the leaders who salt the earth, who refuse to yield an inch, and who force everyone to bow to their specific, rigid way of life. We treat compromise as weakness.
We do.
But Rollo proves that the most permanent, world-altering power doesn't always come from destruction or stubborn purity. Sometimes true historical immortality comes from the willingness to adapt, to assimilate, and to completely change your own identity when the situation demands it. It really makes you wonder how much of our own modern, supposedly inflexible cultures, the traditions we think have been pure since the dawn of time, are actually just built on the quiet, pragmatic compromises of invaders who simply decided it was a better deal to settle down and marry the locals.
It raises a vital question about how we view identity itself. Identity is never static. It is always a negotiation.
Always a negotiation. Well, next time on The Deep Dive, we're leaving the Frankish mainland behind, and we are heading back out to the brutal open sea to meet the most beloved and honestly tragic figure orbiting the Ragnar Lothbrok legend. We're tracking down the real trickster, the brilliant shipbuilder, and the unbelievable story of the discovery of Iceland. Join us next time for Floki the Shipbuilder.
It is going to be a fascinating journey into the extremes of Norse navigation and faith.
You definitely won't want to miss it. But until then, the next time you're stuck in a difficult negotiation or you feel like you're losing an argument, remember the giant Viking who kissed a king's foot by flipping the king upside down into the mud? Sometimes the absolute best way to compromise is to do it entirely on your own terms.